What I Heard Through Van Gogh's Ear. Chapter 1. The Thing in the Jar. Jason didn't go to the garage sale looking for history. He went for a cheap toaster. Instead, he came home with a jar. Inside the jar was an ear, pale, shriveled, and unsettlingly human. The seller swore it was Van Gogh's. She said it the way people say authentic Elvis hair or genuine moon rock, with a shrug that absolved her of responsibility. $5, she said. Conversation piece. Jason laughed, handed over the bill, and carried it home. He thought it would be a gag, something to horrify guests. But that night, when the house was quiet, Jason discovered the ear wasn't just a souvenir. It was a receiver. At first, Jason thought it was tinnitus, a faint hum like a distant radio. Then the hum sharpened into static. And then, voices. Not human voices. They spoke in clipped, metallic tones, layered with echoes. Jason couldn't understand the language, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Orders, reports, strategy. He pressed his own ear to the jar, and the words grew clearer, as if the severed ear was transmitting directly into Jason's skull. Phase 1. Infiltration. Jason froze. His phone was in my hand before he realized it, recording every second. Hours of alien chatter began to fill his files. He was wiretapping a war council. By dawn, Jason had convinced himself it was a prank. Maybe a pirate radio station, maybe some avant-garde art installation. But when he replayed the recording, the words were still there, cold, deliberate, terrifying. Phase 2. Eradication. Jason dropped the phone, his heart hammered. This wasn't a joke. This was a plan. And Jason was the only one who had heard it. Chapter 2. The Erased Recordings. Jason barely slept. His phone was heavy with proof. Hours of alien chatter, clipped voices describing troop movements and orbital coordinates. He imagined headlines, "Local man saves Earth with severed ear." By morning, he was jittery with purpose. He rehearsed his pitch in the mirror. Calm, rational, persuasive. No wild eyes, no frantic gestures. He would walk into the FBI office like a whistleblower. Not a lunatic. The field office was a squat brick building with tinted windows. Inside, the waiting room smelled of burnt coffee and bureaucracy. Jason approached the desk. "I need to speak with someone about national security," he said. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Jason Penrose. I have recordings, alien communications, plans for an invasion." She sighed, picked up the phone, and muttered something. Minutes later, 2 agents appeared, one tall and severe, the other short and skeptical. They ushered Jason into a bland interview room. "Mr. Penrose," the tall agent said, "you claim to have recordings of aliens?" Jason nodded eagerly. "Yes, I captured them last night. They're planning something. You need to hear this." He slid his phone across the table. The agents exchanged a look, then pressed play. Static. Jason leaned forward. "Wait, it's there. Hours of voices. Strategy, invasion plans. Listen." The short agent tapped the screen. "All I hear is white noise." Jason snatched the phone back, horrified. The files were blank, empty. He scrolled frantically. Every recording had vanished. "No," he whispered. "They were here. I swear. I heard them." The agents stood. "Mr. Penrose, we appreciate your concern, but unless you have something tangible, we can't help you." Jason's voice cracked. "You don't understand. They erased it. They know I'm listening. They're covering their tracks." The tall agent's expression softened just enough to suggest pity. "Maybe get some rest." They left him alone in the room. Jason stumbled out of the building, humiliated. He replayed the files again, still blank. But as he drove home from the passenger seat, the ear in its jar began to hum. Static filled his head. Phase 3. Neutralize the receiver. Jason parked at the curb and listened. The voices were back, but only for him. The recordings were gone, erased as if the aliens had reached into his phone and scrubbed them clean. He realized the truth. The ear wasn't just an artifact, it was a wiretap, a living antenna tuned to frequencies no human should hear. And the aliens knew he was listening. That night, Jason sat in his darkened living room, the jar glowing faintly on the coffee table. He pressed his ear against the glass. The voices sharpened. "Terminate the listener." Jason recoiled. His hands shook. He was the only man who knew the invasion was coming. But every attempt to warn others dissolved into static, leaving him isolated, frantic, and desperate. He thought of Van Gogh, letters describing voices in the wind, paintings swirling with impossible skies. What if the ear had been transmitting all along? What if the madness wasn't madness at all, but the burden of overhearing alien war councils? Jason stared at the jar. He wasn't just hearing history, he was reliving it. Chapter 3. The Listener. Jason stopped trusting his phone. Every time he tried to capture the transmissions, the files dissolved. Not erased outright, corrupted, warped, as if the data itself had been chewed through by static. He'd press play and hear nothing but silence, punctuated by faint clicks that sounded like laughter. So he bought a tape recorder, an old, clunky model from a pawn shop. Analog, immune to digital tampering, or so he thought. That night he pressed the recorder against the jar. The ear hummed, then spoke. The voices were sharper now, less like chatter and more like directives. "Advance fleet. Earth coordinates confirmed." Jason's hand trembled as he hit stop. He rewound the tape, pressed play. Silence. The tape hissed, blank. He stared at the recorder, horrified. Whatever was erasing his files wasn't limited to digital. It was reaching into magnetic tape, stripping sound from the reels. The next morning, Jason tried to act normal. He went to the grocery store, stood in line, and told himself he was just another man buying milk. But the voices followed him. Phase 4. Silence the witness. Jason flinched. The cashier gave him a wary look. He realized he'd muttered the phrase aloud. "Long night?" she asked. Jason forced a smile. "Yeah, long night." Back home, he locked the jar in a drawer. He thought maybe distance would help, but the voices seeped through wood and metal, filling the house with whispers. He tried drowning them out with music, blasting old records until the walls shook. But the voices threaded themselves through the songs, hijacking melodies. "Terminate the listener." Jason ripped the needle off the record. The silence was worse. He began to notice patterns. Streetlights flickered when the ear hummed. His television cut to static at odd hours. Even his microwave beeped in alien cadence. The transmissions weren't confined to the jar anymore. They were bleeding into his world. Jason scribbled notes furiously, convinced he was the only man alive who knew what was coming. His handwriting grew frantic, looping into spirals that looked disturbingly like Van Gogh's brushstrokes. He thought of Starry Night. The swirling skies weren't madness. They were maps, coordinates, signals. Jason pressed his forehead against the desk. He wasn't just hearing the invasion, he was becoming part of it. Chapter 4. The Mad Painter. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't the first to hear the voices. The jar sat on his desk, glowing faintly, humming like a hive. He stared at it until dawn, then opened his laptop and began searching. Van Gogh's letters were scattered across archives, translated and digitized. Jason scrolled through them, his pulse quickening. The painter wrote of voices in the wind, of colors that spoke, of a great hum that filled the night. Scholars dismiss these as metaphors, the ramblings of a troubled mind. But Jason knew better. He pulled up Starry Night. The swirling sky wasn't just art, it was a transmission. The spirals matched the cadence of the voices he heard, the rhythm of alien chatter. The brushstrokes weren't madness, they were maps. Jason printed the letters, spread them across his kitchen table, and began connecting dots. Words like invasion, movement, eradication appeared in Van Gogh's descriptions, buried in poetic language. He circled them in red ink, convinced he had uncovered a code. The voices grew louder as he worked. "Terminate the listener." Jason flinched. He pressed the jar to his ear, desperate for clarity. The voices shifted, speaking in fragments that echoed Van Gogh's letters. Colors. Hum. Eradication. Jason's stomach twisted. Van Gogh hadn't been insane. He had been listening until the transmissions drove him to cut off his own ear, desperate to silence them. Jason recoiled from the jar. Was that the plan? To drive him mad, to make him mutilate himself, just to stop the voices. He tried to share his discovery. He emailed professors, art historians, anyone who might take him seriously. He attached scans of Van Gogh's letters, annotated with his notes. Hours later, the emails bounced back. Message corrupted. File unreadable. Jason opened his own attachments. Blank. The words had vanished, replaced with static. The aliens weren't just erasing his recordings, they were erasing history itself. By evening, Jason was pacing the house, muttering to himself. He imagined Van Gogh in his studio, brush in hand, painting furiously to capture what words could not. The skies swirled, the stars pulsed, the colors screamed. Jason grabbed a canvas, splashed paint across it, desperate to translate the transmissions before they vanished. His hands moved without thought, guided by the hum of the ear. Spirals, jagged lines, distorted faces. When he stepped back, the painting was grotesque, terrifying, alive. The voices whispered, "Advance fleet, Earth coordinates confirmed." Jason dropped the brush. He wasn't just documenting history, he was reliving it. Chapter 5. The Broadcast Nobody Heard. Jason stopped leaving the jar at home. He carried it with him, tucked inside a backpack, convinced that if he let it out of his sight, the aliens would reclaim it. The hum followed him everywhere, in his car, in the office, even in the park. The voices had grown bolder. They no longer whispered strategy in fragments, they spoke in full sentences, sharp and deliberate. Advance fleet approaching. Earth defenses minimal. Listener compromised. Jason froze on the sidewalk. He pulled out his phone, hit record, and held the jar close. The voices poured in, crisp and undeniable. He felt vindicated. This time, he would prove it. That evening, he invited a small group of co-workers to his apartment. He dimmed the lights, set the jar on the coffee table, and pressed play. Static. Jason's stomach dropped. He pressed the jar to his ear. The voices were still there, screaming coordinates, issuing commands. But the recording was blank. "Don't you hear it?" he begged. "They're planning an invasion. They're talking right now." His co-workers exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered, "He's lost it." Another whispered, "This is sad." Jason slammed the jar down. "It's real. They're erasing the evidence. They don't want you to know." The group left quickly, murmuring excuses. Jason was alone again, the hum filling the silence. The next day, Jason tried a different tactic. He stood in the town square, notebook in hand, shouting the transmissions as they came through. "Fleet coordinates confirmed. Phase 4. Silence the witness." Pedestrians stopped, stared, then hurried away. A mother pulled her child closer. A man filmed him on his phone, chuckling. Jason's words spread online as a joke, a meme. He was the boy crying wolf, broadcast to the world, mocked instead of believed. That night, Jason sat in his apartment, blinds drawn, jar glowing faintly on the table. He pressed his ear against the glass. The voices were calm now, almost soothing. Listener isolated, neutralization imminent. Jason shivered. He realized the aliens weren't just planning an invasion, they were planning to erase him. One man who knew too much, one man who had heard what no one else could. He thought of Van Gogh again, painting furiously, desperate to translate the transmissions before they consumed him. Jason picked up his brush, dipped it in paint, and began to work. Spirals, jagged lines, distorted faces. His hands moved without thought, guided by the hum. When he stepped back, the canvas was alive with terror. The voices whispered, "Advance fleet, Earth coordinates confirmed." Jason threw the brush across the room. He was going mad. He was becoming Van Gogh. Chapter 6. The wiretap expands. Jason woke to the sound of his alarm clock speaking in alien cadence. The digits on the display flickered, rearranging themselves into coordinates he didn't recognize. He yanked the plug from the wall, but the hum continued, vibrating through the floorboards. The ear was no longer confined to its jar. Its signal had spread, bleeding into every machine in the apartment. The television cut to static mid-broadcast, then whispered, "Listener evolving. Termination in process." Jason staggered back. His microwave beeped in rhythm with the voices. His laptop screen filled with spirals that looked eerily like Van Gogh's brushstrokes. Even the streetlights outside flickered in sync with the transmissions. He tried to fight back. He bought a stack of notebooks, filled them with frantic scribbles, diagrams, and coordinates. But every morning the pages were blank. The ink had vanished overnight, as if the aliens had reached into the paper and scrubbed it clean. Jason screamed at the empty pages. He was being erased, piece by piece. The voices grew more personal. They no longer spoke only of fleets and invasions. They spoke of him, Jason Penrose. Listener identified. Terminate. Jason froze. His name echoed through the apartment, metallic and cold. He pressed the jar to his ear, desperate for clarity. Jason Penrose. Silence required. He dropped the jar, glass shattering across the floor. The ear rolled free, pale and shriveled, humming louder than ever. Jason fled into the street, clutching his head. The hum followed him, bleeding into traffic lights, car radios, even the buzz of neon signs. Pedestrians stared as he shouted warnings, but all they heard was static. He realized the truth. The aliens weren't just planning an invasion. They were rehearsing it, embedding their signals into Earth's infrastructure, testing their ability to erase evidence and silence witnesses. And he was the only witness left. Back in his apartment, Jason swept the shattered glass into a box, cradling the ear like a fragile treasure. He thought of Van Gogh again, painting furiously, desperate to translate transmissions before they consumed him. Jason picked up his brush, dipped it in paint, and began to work. Spirals, jagged lines, distorted faces. His hands moved without thought, guided by the hum. The voices whispered, "Advance fleet, Earth coordinates confirmed, listener termination scheduled." Jason dropped the brush. His canvases glowed faintly in the dark, alive with terror. He wasn't just overhearing the invasion. He was part of it. Chapter 7. The Last Broadcast. Jason decided subtlety had failed. The FBI had dismissed him, his co-workers had laughed, and his neighbors had filmed him like a sideshow. If no one would listen in private, he would shout it in public. He dragged a folding table into the town square, set the jar on top, and hooked up a loudspeaker. His plan was simple: amplify the transmissions until everyone heard them. He pressed the microphone against the jar. Static. Jason's stomach dropped. He pressed his own ear to the glass. The voices were there, screaming coordinates, issuing commands, but the loudspeaker carried only silence. "Advance fleet. Earth coordinates confirmed." Jason shouted the words himself, repeating them into the microphone. Pedestrians stopped, stared, then shook their heads. A teenager filmed him, laughing. A woman muttered, "Poor man." Jason's voice cracked. "They're coming. I've heard them through Van Gogh's ear. You have to believe me." The crowd dispersed. His broadcast had failed. That night, Jason sat in his apartment, new jar glowing faintly on the table. He pressed his ear against it, desperate for clarity. The voices were calm now, almost mocking. Listener isolated. Neutralization imminent. Jason recoiled. His hands shook. He realized the aliens weren't just erasing evidence. They were erasing him. He turned to painting again, canvases stacked against the walls, spirals, jagged lines, distorted faces. His brush moved without thought, guided by the hum. Each canvas pulsed faintly in the dark, alive with terror. Jason stared at them, horrified. He had become Van Gogh, mad, isolated, dismissed. His art was the only record left, the only proof of what he had heard. The voices whispered, "Advance fleet, Earth coordinates confirmed, listener termination scheduled for immediate implementation." Jason dropped the brush. His canvases glowed faintly, a gallery of warnings no one would believe. Chapter 8. The Listener, Confronted. Jason no longer trusted silence. Every pause in conversation, every lull in the city's hum, was filled with whispers only he could hear. The transmissions had grown intimate, no longer distant chatter but direct commands. He jolted awake to find the words echoing through his apartment. The jar glowed faintly on the table, the ear pulsing like a heartbeat. He pressed his head against it, desperate for clarity. The voices sharpened. "Jason Penrose, you are compromised. You are the wiretap." Jason staggered back. He wasn't just overhearing them. He was part of the circuit. The ear had fused with him, made him a living antenna. His skull buzzed with static. That night, the confrontation escalated. Jason's apartment dissolved into a haze of light and sound. The walls rippled with spirals, his furniture bent into impossible angles. He saw figures, shadows shaped like soldiers, their faces blurred, their mouths moving in sync with the voices. "Advance fleet, Earth coordinates confirmed." Jason shouted. "Why me? Why Van Gogh? Why us?" The shadows turned. Their voices overlapped, metallic and cold. Van Gogh was the first. He painted what he heard. You will paint what you hear. The invasion must be recorded. The listener must be silenced. Jason's knees buckled. He clutched his head, static roaring in his ears. He thought of Van Gogh, brush in hand, painting furiously to capture transmissions no one else believed. He thought of the severed ear, cut away in desperation, a futile attempt to end the voices. Jason grabbed his canvas, splashed paint across it, spirals and jagged lines forming a grotesque map. His brush moved without thought, guided by the hum. The shadows loomed closer. Chapter 9. The Attempted Silence. Jason stared at the ear, pulsing faintly in the dim light. The thing refused to die. It hummed louder now, uncontained, vibrating against the wood like a living alarm. He grabbed a hammer. His hands shook as he raised it high, ready to crush the relic once and for all. But before the blow landed, the voices surged through him, filling his skull with static. "Jason Penrose, listener termination scheduled. Do not resist." The hammer slipped from his grip. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. The hum was unbearable, a chorus of alien commands drilling into his brain. He realized the ear wasn't just an object, it was a conduit. Destroying it wouldn't silence the voices. It would silence him. Jason fled into the night, carrying the ear wrapped in a towel. He drove aimlessly, headlights cutting through empty streets, convinced distance might weaken the signal. But the voices followed. "Advance fleet. Earth coordinates confirmed. Infiltration complete." Jason slammed the brakes. His chest tightened. He looked up at the sky. The stars seemed to swirl, shifting into spirals that mirrored Van Gogh's brushstrokes. He realized the invasion wasn't coming. It had already begun. He pulled into a deserted field, dropped to his knees, and dug furiously at the dirt. He buried the ear, covered it with soil, and staggered back, panting. For a moment, silence. Then the ground hummed. The soil vibrated. The voices rose again, muffled but relentless. Jason Penrose, listener identified, burial ineffective. Jason screamed. He clawed at the dirt, pulled the ear free, and hurled it into the night. It landed with a dull thud, glowing faintly in the grass. Back in his car, Jason gripped the steering wheel, trembling. He thought of Van Gogh again, cutting off his own ear, desperate to silence the transmissions. Maybe that was the only way. Maybe mutilation was the price of peace. He pressed his palms against his head, imagining the knife, the blood, the relief. But the voices interrupted, cold and final. Jason Penrose, listener termination imminent, advance fleet engaged. Jason looked up. The sky was alive with movement, shadows shifting, lights flickering, shapes descending. The invasion had begun. Chapter 10. The Counter Signal. Jason stood in the field, the sky alive with movement. Shadows shifted above, lights flickered, shapes descended. The invasion was no longer a whisper. It was visible, undeniable. The ear pulsed in his hands, humming louder than ever. The voices screamed, "Jason Penrose, listener termination imminent, advance fleet engaged." Jason's grip tightened. He realized the ear wasn't just a receiver, it was a transmitter. Every time he listened, every time he recorded, he wasn't amplifying their signal. He was part of it. But if he could hear them, maybe he could speak back. He pressed the ear against his mouth, absurd and desperate. "Stop! Abort! Retreat!" Static roared. The voices faltered. For the first time, they hesitated. Jason's heart pounded. He shouted again, louder, mimicking their clipped cadence. "Phase cancel. Fleet compromised. Retreat." The hum shifted. The sky flickered. The descending lights wavered, confused. The alien chatter fractured, overlapping in panic. "Abort! Abort! Coordinates corrupted." Jason realized he had become the wiretap in reverse. He wasn't just overhearing their invasion. He was jamming it. He ran home, set the ear on his desk, and hooked it to every speaker he owned. He blasted his improvised commands into the night, filling the air with false orders. "Fleet compromised. Retreat. Listener neutralized. Abort mission." The voices screamed in protest, but the signal was scrambled. The invasion fleet faltered, their coordination collapsing. Above the city, lights flickered, then vanished. The sky returned to silence. Jason collapsed, gasping. He hadn't destroyed the ear. He had used it, turned their own weapon against them. The jar glowed faintly, humming with residual static. The voices whispered, weaker now, fractured and uncertain. "Jason Penrose. Interference detected. Invasion postponed." Jason stared at the ear. He knew the silence wouldn't last. The fleet would regroup. The transmissions would return. But for now, Earth was safe. He whispered, "What I heard through Van Gogh's ear saved us." And for the first time, the voices did not answer. Epilogue. The listener's confession. Jason sat in the dim glow of his apartment, canvases stacked like barricades against the walls. The city outside carried on with its ordinary hum, traffic lights blinking, televisions buzzing, laughter spilling from open windows. None of it reached him. He had saved them, though no one would ever know. On the table the ear lay in its fractured jar, pale and shriveled, humming faintly like a dying radio. Jason leaned forward, elbows pressed to the wood, and spoke softly. "You're the only one who listens," he said. "The only one who doesn't laugh or walk away or call me mad. You don't roll your eyes, you don't pity me. You just, hmm." The ear pulsed faintly, static filling the silence. Jason's voice grew steadier. "I tried to warn them. I shouted in the streets, begged the FBI, painted until my hands bled. But they don't hear it. They don't hear you. They don't hear what I heard. They never will." He paused, staring at the ear. "Van Gogh did, though. He heard you. He painted the invasion in the sky, in the stars, in the spirals. They called him insane. They'll call me insane, too. But we weren't mad. We were just listeners. The first and the last." The hum deepened as if the ear approved. Jason leaned closer, whispering, "I stopped them. For now. I turned your signal against them. I jammed their fleet, scrambled their coordinates. But they'll come back. You know they will. And when they do, I'll be ready. You and me, ear to ear, against the universe." He laughed bitterly. "Imagine that. Jason Penrose, savior of Earth, confiding in a severed ear. No one will believe me, but you do. You always do." The ear pulsed once more, faintly, like a heartbeat. The static rose, then faded into silence. Jason closed his eyes, exhausted. "I'll keep painting. I'll keep recording. Even if they erase it all, even if the world mocks me. Someone has to remember. Someone has to keep the signal alive. That's what Van Gogh did. That's what I'll do. Until they silence me." He sat back, staring at the canvases glowing faintly in the dark. His voice dropped to a whisper. "What I heard through Van Gogh's ear saved us. And what I hear tomorrow might save us again." The ear hummed softly, patient, eternal, waiting for the next transmission. The end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.